You're listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Welcome to the CraftsmanOnline podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmanOnline.com, and you've joined us for an episode on the perfect points of entrance as we welcome back Brother John Nagy for a review of the perfect points of entrance and how over the years they have been presented and exactly what they truly allude. Welcome back, Brother John.
Thanks again for having me, Brother Michael. It's an honor and a privilege.
I have to say, this is part of the ritual that have gone through it as an entered apprentice, and then even visiting back, it's never very easily understood or fully explained as to what the perfect points of entrance are, because there's a debate on how many points consist of it. And I guess the big question is, when and how did this become part of Masonic ritual?
Well, that's a great question. And as usual, answers may vary depending on who you talk with. I do know that the earliest catechisms that I encountered only had 3. And that was quite a surprise when I saw, wait a second, where's the 4th one? And why are the other 3 nothing like what it is that I remember the first 3 to be in my particular run through? So it's interesting. I'm going to reference back to a book called The Craft Perfected, Actualizing Our Craft, I wrote a few years back, and starting on page 59. It's a very small section of the book, 59 through 65, just a few pages, and it goes to me scratching my head because I had the same experience as you. It's like, well, I know I'm supposed to somehow fit those 4 points into the virtues and try to make sense of it, but none of it made any sense to me. It was almost like it was being force-fed and force-fit. And I was supposed to be able to not only state it, but state the connections that I'm being told they were, and somehow regurgitate that with a pat on the back and let's move on to the next piece of information that I'm supposed to memorize. It never made any sense when I was going through, and none of the brothers could explain it to me.
And I like how you started out your answer by saying it depends on who you ask, because I'm in the same boat. It was one of those things where, as an entered apprentice, there's so much that happens that night when you take the first degree of masonry and you hear this expression, the perfect points of your entrance, and you're like, I don't even know what that means. And then when you go through your Masonic catechism or your education study for proficiency, when you say who you ask, so as a New York Freemason, I just know that that's one of the ways to recognize me as a Freemason is by the perfect points of my entrance. They probably told me during what we call the historical lecture, but there was so much coming at me that night that I didn't really pick up the perfect points until I moved down here to DC, where they actually say the perfect points of the entrance in ritual, which is out there, which are referred to as the principal points: the entrance, the preparation, the obligation, the sign, the grip, the token, or the word, which are the guttural, the pedal, the manual, or the pectoral. And again, you hear that, but you're like, what does it mean?
And therein lies, I think, one of the biggest confusing points is that we hear the word perfect, we connect it to points, and then we hear entrance, and we're somehow supposed to understand what it is that these mean to us. And the fact of the matter is, the word perfect used today, when it is connected with other words to create terms and phrases, does not have the meaning that it meant back when it was first adopted. And I tried to force fit it myself. I knew that one of the dominant meanings back in the 1800s, the word perfect literally meant mature, sane, complete, adult, and suitable, not today's definition like flawless. So I tried to force fit those meanings from the 1800s into it, and it still didn't make any sense until I started reading things having to do with legalese. And let me give you a few. I'm going to make reference here. To perfect is to satisfy all requirements. corresponding to an ideal standard or abstract concept, legally valid or complete. And I'm saying to myself, okay, so when I hear perfect points of entrance, these are the standards to which all brothers are being entered into the lodge by. You had mentioned 5 things: the preparation, the obligations, signs, grips or tokens, and word. And when you put all that together, there's a set of sequences that the brothers have to go through in order for them to be entered properly. And when you hear perfect points of entrance, it's really all the standard ways of bringing a brother in have to be put forth in due form to assure that the candidate was brought in properly. Now, I'm going to digress a bit because I've written absolutely nothing about this, but this has been some really neat conversations that I've had with other master masons who are a bit learned and know how to go from conjecture to pure speculation based on what it is that they've read. And I'm going to venture into that with you. As an operative mason, if you go back to the standard of entrance for an apprentice in an operative setting, they had to be able of birth, which is to say, freeborn with all limbs intact. And when you consider the perfect points of entrance and apply it back to the time in the Stone Age, when we literally were doing stonecraft entrance of apprentices, let's go through them. Give me the first perfect point of entrance out of the 4. The very first one is what?
Yeah. So guttural to me, and I still, honestly, this is just me speaking freely because only until this episode have I really kind of dived into the research on this. But to me, guttural is just like how somebody like physically sounds when they speak. Like, are they intelligible or can they be understood when they're speaking to others?
And you're making the point that I'm attempting to allude to in my questions. Guttural, you have to literally use your voice to say, I want to join.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but when we go back to that phrase, able of birth, which is to say, freeborn with all limbs intact, that entire phrase basically means that the individual who is coming in must be free of all flaws that would prevent them from becoming a master mason. Well, if they can't speak, right away, you've got a hindrance to them coming in. So at the most basic level, if you can't speak, you're not freeborn with all limbs intact. The entire statement basically says that everything is operational, not only physically, but intellectually. And so if a person is unable to voice, first of all, that they want to join, and second, be able to exchange with another human being verbal commands and verbal questions and what have you, they are not capable of meeting the requirement of the perfect points of entrance.
Right.
And it's with their voice that they obligate themselves. I mean, we can go down the entire list. How are they recognized by others by the use of their words if they can't say anything?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
that's number 1. Okay, so now we've got one perfect point of entrance understood in such a way that it makes sense. And oh, by the way, none of this is explained by our brothers, right?
Right. I think, and what I love about this season on the podcast and the visits that you've had on the episodes is that we're really diving into a lot of the grist of material that is not covered anywhere really in Masonic education. Not only with brothers and lodges, but people just don't ask. They kind of glaze over this phrase. When I heard the perfect points of my entrance and was taught what that meant in the catechism, I thought it was, oh, okay, I came into a lodge, I was dressed properly, I sharpened my corners, I stood the way I was supposed to stand, I was the perfect candidate going through the degrees as I could be. But that is not what we're talking about here.
You mispronounce automaton. I'm sorry for, literally, honestly, when you consider how we go through, we're told what to do, we're directed on how to do it, and we're told what to say back in return when asked, but none of it is understood. So,
Mm.
we're rolling up our sleeves right now and let's tackle the second one.
Yeah. So the second one is, so we start from the gut and we move up to the pectoral, which to me, I just think of working out at the gyms, and it's a pec day. So we're going to do some chest exercises. The only thing I can think of in Freemasonry is that we're told that within our chest is the most vital organ that we're supposed to protect. But outside of, again, that's physical. So I'm thinking if somebody has like a chest deficiency or a physical abnormality, that would subtract your perfect points of entrance there.
Let me ask a simple question, and maybe you can tie it into the pectoral. Where were you first prepared?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Does it make sense now?
Yep. And it's also alluding to where you were first received. So yes.
Yes. Yeah. And so you've got a whole string of things associated with the pectoral.
So do you look at that as like having a strong chest, like physically, that you're I don't want to use the word like able-bodied, but physically strong, like you can be laborious, like you can do work as like operative masons? Or do you look at it as I am a very bound person to where I would not say I can keep things secret in my chest?
And you are just like running with it beautifully. At the raw as stonecraft level, they have the musculature to do the work. Okay. But when we take that to the speculative sense, we don't want to enter any brothers who are really not prepared to become a mason. So when you talk about pectoral, we're talking about, is the person totally prepared to become a mason? And if they don't, well, they're missing the pectoral aspect, and are they willing to keep within their chest the secrets of masonry? Well, if they're not that, then they miss the pectoral aspect. I mean, I go down the list of things having to do with the sharp implement, kind of reminding you, hey, you've got to keep this stuff in your chest and abide by what we're about to say. And if that person doesn't have the pectoral aspect of entrance, why would we want to have them enter into our craft?
So I know we're moving from the floor up. So it goes guttural, pectoral, then we get to manual. And honestly, John, the only thing I can think about with manual is we've all bought, or hopefully a car or something that requires the owner's manual, and that you're able to read it and fix or do whatever maintenance is required. That's the only thing that comes to. I've never understood manual from that point.
Well, let me ask you a question. Maybe this can help tie it in. Have you ever done manual labor?
Of course.
Okay. And what did you use in order for you to do manual labor?
I would say a strong back. Yeah.
Well, manual comes from manage, which means to basically use your hands. And this goes back to the able at birth, all limbs intact. If you do not have the ability to reach out with your hand and sign the petition, reach out the hand and greet a brother, and put your hand on the volume of sacred law, and so on and so forth. If you don't have that ability, symbolically, what happens is you're really not a candidate. You have to be able to manage things, and managing is manual. And if you lack the ability to manage even the barest essentials of your own life, why would we want you in the craft?
It's very true. I mean, I think about it now where a lot of lodges are facing the uphill challenge of getting brothers to come and participate in meetings and engaging them and trying to produce programs or whatever we can to make this experience what they were seeking. And that's absolutely a question that I think everyone is talking about when they say guarding the West Gate. It's, yes, we should be looking at the quality or the character of the individual, but also, are they really doing this to just get this small thing and then leave? Or are they looking to make a lifelong commitment? Because Freemasonry is it's a way of life. It's not just a short-term agreement that you make.
Agreed. And when you look at just the first three, if the person lacks the ability to communicate, doesn't have the heart for what it is they're about to get involved in, and are unable to even manage the barest aspects of their lives, why would we want them?
Absolutely.
So, we've got three of the four perfect points kind of delved into. Is there another one?
The last one, this one can be confusing because if you read it incorrectly, it looks like it says the pedal. It's the pedal. And to me, when I first heard it, I thought of the penile, like the pineal gland in your mind, because I understood we're working our way from the floor up. So to this, that's all I have for an explanation. I'm turning over to learn from you.
Yeah, well, the word is pronounced pedal, Pedal, and refers to pedestal. And basically, what we're talking about here are your legs. Again, from an operative sense, all limbs intact. So, what happens here is when we take the operative sense, of course, you would not want to have any apprentice that can't communicate, can't do manual labor, cannot manage, and also has no standing. Why would we want them?
Mm.
However, when you consider that what it stands for is this is how an apprentice enters into the and across the threshold from the profane world to the temple world. This is how they circumambulate. And this is how they wind up moving about the lodge. This is what they use to first approach the altar to commit to, the obligations that are required. So much of this goes back to the operative, but when you see what the pedal is associated with, it has to do with justice. And if an individual is incapable of movement, if they're stuck, if they're not able to emulate, and also if they have no standing of justice in their lives, as in a value system, why would we want them to enter? So these are some of the things that come up very quickly for me, only after 20 years of examination.
I guess that's where I feel very, relieved in a certain sense that as a junior to your seasoned and senior time in masonry, I'm just now beginning to get a grip of this. And I hope that's a service that we can provide to our listener that, as we mentioned from the outset, a lot of this sometimes just gets looked right over or is honestly never really acknowledged or fully explained. So it's kind of refreshing to hear that, wow, 20 years into the craft and he's still seeking that light.
I wrote about this early on back in 2009 in Building Hiram, and I was still scratching my head at that time. I had been in the craft for, oh gosh, about 8 or 9 years at that point. And it wasn't until I wrote The Craft Perfected and actually looked at the word perfect and aligned it with the perfect points of entrance. I was looking at the perfect ashlar and I discovered gobs of information about the perfect ashlar that nobody really explored before. And it was only after I completed my study of the perfect ashlar, I said, well, wait a second, this word perfect is being used elsewhere in our ritual. And, and the first one that came to my mind was what I was introduced early on was the perfect points of entrance. And so I started exploring that and I said to myself, holy crow, there was initially in catechisms only three. And let me hold on. Let me go over those three because it's pretty interesting compared to what we've got today. There's a catechism and it goes on, but I'll hit the highlights. The question is, but as I am the examiner, you may safely reveal to me the points of entrance. And there's a little exchange. And then finally, the candidate or the responder says, that's number one, of my own free will and accord, which makes sense because that's exactly what you want to make sure when a person is entering, that is of their own free will and accord, at the door of the lodge, that's number two, and on the point of a sharp implement. And those were the perfect points of entrance. And I said, holy crow, how do we go from that to, what we have today? And of course, you alluded to 5 things that are covered. But if you notice, the one thing that is common amongst all 3 of these, the 3, 4, and 5, and by the way, when you mentioned the 5, we're talking about preparation, obligation, sign, gripper token, and word. And if you notice those 5, if we look at the commonality between those 5 and the of, on, that I just described, and the perfect points of 4, so we got 3, 4, and 5. What's common amongst every last one of them is that there is a process for bringing brothers in that has to be met in order for the process to be satisfied, complete, legal, valid. And so the 3, well, yes, each and every one of them is valid. And the 5 that you mentioned early on, they're all valid. And the 4 that we have been harping on, they're all valid. They're all process oriented, things to consider. And in all honesty, every last one of these sets of 3, 4, and 5, which I just love saying 3, 4, and 5.
Well, I'm sure to those that are in the know are like, wait, he means 3, 5, and 7.
No, I like 3, 4, and 5 because they refer to the Preston Webb ritual of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th tools, the working tools. We're talking about, the square being the 5th one, and what we have, the plumb of the level in the square. The square is always the 5th one. And wow, we're talking about the 3, 4, 5 triangle. We're talking about the 3rd, 4th, and 5th tools. And here we have another set where you actually have 3, 4, and 5 different points of entrance, depending on what part of the history you're in, what part of the country, world.
Right.
And they all are indicating the same thing, that there has to be a entrance requirement that has to be fulfilled in order for it to be complete, legal, valid. You get it.
So
I see my head going up
well,
and down.
I had a question that was building on this, and you're like, yes, he's gotten to the point of it where, to me, it seems like they understood that there were, for lack of a better term, variations of how ritual was being performed, or Freemasonry to an extent was even being practiced throughout the different jurisdictions in the United States. And this was in probably, from England to everywhere around the world. And to me, it seems like this was an early attempt to try to, in some form, either standardize or codify ritual to where, you may have had a local tradition or variation that was in place, but there were certain things that all men could agree upon. Like, yes, when I went to lodge to get my first degree in Freemasonry, I went through this same experience that you did.
I went through it, and you'll go through it, or you've gone through it. There was definitely standardization going on at some level. In fact, I think the Baltimore Convention was all an effort to standardize ritual throughout the entire United States. It didn't succeed in some respects, and it succeeded in others. But what we have now is a more homogenous experience for brothers going through. So no matter where you go in the United States, except for certain jurisdictions, 1 or 2 which will go unnamed, you're going to go through pretty much the same ritual.
Right.
But the standardization of the perfect points of entrance, you talk about that. Yeah, everybody knows about it in the United States, no matter what state you're in, what jurisdiction you're in. And whether you are of what is considered mainstream, Prince Hall, or even some of the clandestines, they all go through the same thing because they're using the same material.
Right. And I don't know if it's a modern interpretation, because I love how you have really focused on that word perfect and how the meaning of it has evolved over time. But when I hear that, it reminds me, okay, if I am a traveling man, if I'm visiting another jurisdiction, I need to be proficient in what I know a Freemason is to be so that I can be accepted by these other brothers.
Agreed. And we go back to, we all went through the same process of entrance, and we met specific qualifications in doing so. We jumped through certain hoops, and we met certain qualifications in jumping through those hoops. We all know that you were first prepared in your heart. We all know that we can communicate and understand when we're talking to another Mason, whether they're a Mason or not. We also know that part and parcel of what it is that we are trying to improve is how we are managing our lives. And if our lives are unmanageable, you're really not a candidate for what
Mm,
it is that we have to offer. You have to have some level of manageability. And when you're talking about manual, you're talking about, is the person capable of managing? And good God, if they are capable of managing, we've got to teach them how to do emotional management and time management. And that's just the base level.
mm.
And of course, we've got the last one having to do with justice. We're talking about, can they stand on their own 2 feet? And are they capable of movement? Now, we're talking really not about physical feet here. We're talking about symbolic.
Yeah.
Can the person stand on their own 2 feet? Now, that's a metaphorical expression. It's not supposed to be taken literally, it's supposed to be taken symbolically. Yeah. And
Well, no, I'm sitting here thinking like hearing the perfect points of the entrance. I'm writing down the note. Go back and read the charge of the entered apprentice. And through that lens of now having a better understanding of the perfect point of the entrance, doesn't that take on a whole new meaning?
definitely.
Yeah. Talk
So,
about a wider viewpoint. Like, wow.
and what's interesting is most candidates haven't got a clue as to what it is that they are being evaluated on. And yet we are telling them right there in the very beginning, we're evaluating you on the perfect points of entrance.
Mm,
Are you your word? Are you capable of communicating? Is your heart in it? Can you stand on your own 2 feet? And last but not least, what was the one I didn't mention?
guttural pedal manual.
Are they
Hands.
capable
Are
of
you strong?
are they capable of managing their own lives?
Right.
When I was going from one lodge to another, moving my mother lodge, I was moving my shingle from one lodge to the other. And what happened was I had 2 pages of questionnaires, and every last one of the questions was directed toward me having a stable life and showing that I could manage what it is that I was doing outside the lodge. And part
Mm,
and part of that was they didn't want to bring somebody in the lodge that whose life was basically a disaster. Why would they want to have a brother coming into their lodge that was going to literally foster dependency upon them? They weren't looking for that.
right.
Even though
Yeah.
I was a brother, even though,
Right.
you
Well,
know,
to build on what you're saying, and there's a big movement now about one getting back to the basics in Freemasonry, and we could save that for another podcast because I think that's the low
please,
lying
yes,
fruit. But the other is there's this push in many jurisdictions called like guarding the West Gate, right? And that we need to assess better qualities of candidates. And to what you just said, if we actually start using the perfect points of entrance as the measuring stick, I think that's going to bring us more qualified candidates.
well, it will definitely filter out those candidates that really need to work on themselves a little more before they come through that gate.
Right.
And
Right.
there are a tremendous amount of individuals approaching us that are just not mature, and they really don't qualify. They have lives that are messes. Their attitudes show that their heart's really not in the spirit of what we have to offer. But they want to join because for them it's a trophy, and
Right. Right.
some
No,
actually,
you're
some actually will join to get that trophy just by participating.
right. I think we look at the necessary requirements to become a Freemason. We're like, check, 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 check. Oh, all those boxes are checked. Like, let's push this petition and this gentleman through. But I agree with what you're saying is in order to slow down the process, we need to start holding them to a higher standard of the lodge and understanding that, as you say, no man is perfect when they come into the craft. What's our goal is to make good men better. And how can the strengths of what we have as a lodge, as a group of brothers, help this man become a better version of himself? What you're saying is, can we take this improvement project on?
It's really simple. You just take a look at what we've been talking about and develop a series of interview questions having to do with the ability of the individual to stand on their own 2 feet. Are they living an orderly, managed life? And are they capable of communicating and voicing not only their desire to join, but communicate succinctly the reasons behind it? And
Mm.
are they really properly prepared to become a Mason in their heart? Yeah.
These are good questions. So, Brother John, we've talked a lot about the speculative side of the perfect points of the entrance. I want to kind of transition more now to the operative or the esoteric side of it. And doing some research into our episode, I consulted Coyle's Masonic Encyclopedia, and it offers this definition: the four perfect points of entrance constitute the esoteric closing of each of the lectures on temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice, to which they respectively do not apply, illustrate, or in any way belong, so that the esoteric portions of the four lectures have to be somewhat manipulated to make a connection with them. Now, I'll tell you this: I went to law school for 1 year, and when I read that definition, I felt like I honestly got nothing from it. So, esoterically, my question to you is, as a learned, seasoned brother, do you feel that the perfect points allude to the entrance of the candidate into lodge, as we've discussed, or is there also a possibility that some of the ceremony, the ritual of being admitted or becoming obligated to the craft, are also instilled into the perfect points of entrance?
Yes.
Perfect answer.
So let me expand on that. Yes. In order for you to understand where I'm coming from, you have to understand first that there's a huge difference between accepted and admitted. There's oh gosh, I think that I've got a blog spot on this that actually became a chapter in one of my books in the Craft Unmasked. When I did some study on the word accepted, I thought at the time that I did the research, I came into that research believing that accepted and admitted were basically synonymous to each other. And as I explored and looked up Mackey and a few other wonderful authors out there, I found that the word accepted, literally at the time it was being used in free and accepted Masons, meant to make a person a Mason, to join the craft. So when we talk about the word accepted, they are becoming a member of the craft, either by joining, being accepted into the craft, being made a Mason. All these words are synonymous. And that has to do with coming into the actual craft of Masonry and how we view it in the fraternity, becoming a member of Freemasonry. However, admitted means to join a lodge. So accepted means to join the craft, as in the discipline and the profession, whereas admitted is to join in with others in that profession. And when you come into the West Gate, you are coming into not the lodge, but you are coming into the craft. And it isn't until you obligate yourself that you are just a seeker trying to be accepted in a profession.
Right.
But it is after you are accepted as a member of the craft that you can be admitted into the lodge. And that's why I said to you, yes, because
Yeah. Well, what you're explaining to me is that if there was a bar for Freemasonry, and by bar, I mean, this is the difference between talking to somebody who has an MD or a PhD, and why, yes, on paper, they're a doctor, but they'll say, I'm not a practicing physician. I have not taken the boards to become that. Like, yes, you can go to law school and get a legal degree, but until you pass the bar, you cannot be a practicing attorney. Big differences here. And exactly what you're talking about, because for me, when I first thought, going back to the perfect points of my entrance, were, yes, not only how I entered the lodge, but everything that I was instructed to do up until the moment and beyond when I took the obligation as to how I was physically positioned and the words and responses that I was given, the literal instruction on how to be the brother at that level.
And that is why I said yes, because as the perfect points of entrance reflect, you are not becoming a lodge member. You are becoming a member of the craft. And it is only after you become a member of the craft that you can be admitted into a lodge.
Mm.
There's so many subtleties to what's going on here. And unless you understand the different levels and what's really going on, a lot of it just is a blur, and you can easily mistake one for the other, which you're not.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
you shouldn't.
And I know at the beginning of the podcast, somewhere in that disclaimer, I say these are our opinions or in our viewpoints and not that of any green. But I would just like to impress this upon our listener. If you happen to be a brother, I believe that displaying the perfect points of the entrance is also what makes you a master mason or brother mason, whatever degree that you're on. And by that, I mean, don't fall to the point where it's acceptable to give sloppy do-guards and signs. Don't fall to the point where it's acceptable in your heart or your mind to not give the proper floor work or treat everything that's happening with the reverence that it should when you're in lodge. Don't allow that to happen. Keep your standard high, because as you know, Brother John has said, like, perfect is not what we can achieve. It's a standard that we are trying to strive to reach.
And I understand where you're going with this. I'll say the following. There are multiple levels of these four perfect points of entrance. And when they add the four cardinal virtues,
Mm.
the four cardinal virtues are what we are to aspire to have internalized as a consequence of doing the work of the entered apprentice. So we've got the four perfect points of entrance coming into the craft. But what's really neat is there's joining the craft and then actually becoming the craft. And
Yeah.
and when you look at the four cardinal virtues that are put together with the perfect points of entrance, you start to realize that you really don't become a mature craft member until you have internalized those four virtues. Because literally, and I'm going to take it to the next level, brother, because that's where you like to go with it. If you do not have those four cardinal virtues internalized by the time that you are done with your entered apprentice work and ready to pass to the fellow craft, you're not ready.
Mm.
Because the fellow craft, you have to have at a minimum the four cardinal virtues internalized. And along with them, the three theological virtues must also be internalized, because if you don't have all of those internalized and acting out in your life on a daily basis, you really haven't passed to the fellow craft stage level.
Right.
You're still working on a common ashlar, which I refer to as a rough ashlar that's being worked and not yet perfected.
Mm. And if you've heard our episode with Brother Nagy on the lost word and the secrets of being a master mason, I would also say one of the ways to recognize that you're a master mason is in your actions, in your words, how you conduct yourself. And to, again, not to keep beating the same drum, but that to me is also reflected in the perfect points of your entrance, not just in lodge, but also in life.
What are certain signs?
Yeah.
Are you upright, unbiased in your ways? Do you have the square of virtue literally driving everything that you do? And are you fair and equitable in all that you do with yourself and others? You've got three right there. And you can see through the behavior and the choices of a master mason whether they had actually internalized their fellow craft working tools or not. If they have, you see the signs. If they haven't, well, you can see those too.
So before we close the door on this episode of the perfect points of entrance, and just as a refresher, they are the guttural, pectoral, manual, and pedal. Brother John, I got to ask, do you have a favorite perfect point?
That is a great question, and I really wish that I had been properly prepared for that in my heart and in my mind.
Well, I can give my answer because I thought about this.
Go ahead, please do. And
by some time. So for me, I would say my favorite is the guttural, and based on what I had thought, researched, and then of course learned during our discussion, I really feel that it's important, and I always remind brothers during the entered apprentice degree, the word that we're given, caution. And I feel it's so important that we as Masons are cognizant and are very judicious when it comes to the words that we choose, not just what they mean. And this is what makes it so difficult in today's world. Like, I'm a 45-year-old man, and I feel an extreme disconnect with the generation that's just behind me because they use different words that have different meanings to me. And as a Freemason, my thought is like, I want to be able to communicate effectively to them, but also in a way that's not offensive to them. So to a lesser extent, I really feel that the guttural is all about in developing those active listening skills, but also good word choice so that you can be an effective communicator.
I will say that I love and have internalized all of them, but if you were to ever experience me, you'd recognize every last one of them comes through in what it is that I say. And so I would have to say, I don't know if it's my favorite, but my guttural point is the one that I use most often. And therefore, I'd have to say it shines, but really what it is a showcase for the other three that back what it is that I'm saying. So I guess that would have to be my favorite one then.
Well, I think as the wise Jedi Yoda, you're able to embrace all of them. But no, it's also an example. Like, having spent time on our podcast and just knowing you, there's no doubt that if I was to step into your place of business or into your lodge or into your home, that you would be the same man, the same John that I know in all three of those places.
Ah, intuitive you are. I hope to see the same thing said about me 10 years from now as I start declining.
This has been the Craftsman Online podcast. And again, I want to thank our wise Yoda for coming and joining us. No, seriously, one of my favorite guests to have come on every month. And I learned so much from him and continue to do so. Brother John Nagy, thank you again for being a part of this.
A pleasure and honor it has been, my good friend.
If you've enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, you can tell Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online podcast. We're available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.
You've been listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
So before we close the door on this episode of the Perfect Points of Wrench,
Rewind, say it again. Before, and we're done.
we're done.
Beep, beep.